Hello and welcome to another episode of Adulting with Hannah. I'm Hannah, here today to talk about some more serial killers. If you're new to my channel, I really hope you subscribe. It's free and it helps me a lot. It helps more people see my videos, especially videos like this. These take me a really long time to research, but I'm really fascinated by the subject. So for those of you who are new to the series, I've been researching serial killers based on their zodiac sign because I just need to know if there's a connection or if like certain signs are more susceptible to different types of murder, or I don't know. I just want to find some connections. So I've been compiling some data, but in my research, I just wanted to share the people that I've learned about along the way. So today we are going to be talking about all of the known serial killers who are Capricorn. There's actually the most Capricorn serial killers on the list with 55, which is quite a bit more than all the others. I found this list on a blog article, so if it's comprehensive or not, I'm not sure, but we are going to be talking about 55 different serial killers who are Capricorns today. There's a few that I will go a little more in depth about, but most of them are just going to be very surface level. And full disclosure, I got all this information from Wikipedia. I was researching 55 different people. This is my 6th or 7th video that I've done, so I've researched hundreds of serial killers at this point, so I just don't have time to do in-depth research. But if I ever come across somebody that I know there's like other people out there who've done really in-depth research, I will let you know. So I just want you to know, and I don't want to be one of those people that's like, stay to the end of the video, but when I'm telling you that like one of the last ones on this list is one of my most feared and creeped out serial killers of all time, wait till the end of the video. He's not the very last one, but he's one of the last ones, and I'm telling you, this guy's crazy. And I'll let you know when it's that one. So I hope you stick around at least for that one. Okay, without further ado, let's talk about some murderers. First on the list is Niles Hogel. He was actually born in Germany, December 30th, 1976. So his dad was a nurse, his mom was a paralegal, pretty average. So he actually became a nurse like his father, but he was one of those nurses that liked to kill people. And if you've watched any of my other videos, there's like almost always some sort of like healthcare professional that kills. So that's not zodiac sign specific, as we've learned. But if you've heard of any healthcare professionals that kill people, they tend to kill like a lot of people. Like they go hard, which is really scary. So he started working in the ICU at a German hospital in 1999, and the staff noticed that like 58% of all the deaths in the ICU happened while he was working, which is very strange. So they were like, let's just transfer you to anesthesiology. That's a good idea. What? So in 2001, he gets transferred to anesthesiology. So then obviously the same trends continued. The person in charge of anesthesiology noticed that Hogel was there a lot of the time that deaths were happening, especially during emergencies or like spontaneous resuscitations. Like he just always noticed that Hogel was there. So this head physician confronted Hogel and was like, hey, why are you always here when all this stuff is happening? In 2002. So like pretty short succession. So they were trying to get Hogel to resign, but it turns out they instead just transferred him to the logistics department. So in October 2002, they're like trying to get him to leave. So the director of nursing sent a reference letter for Hogel so he could get a job elsewhere. And the reference letter said he had circumspect, diligent, and autonomous work ethic, as well as having prudently and in an objectively correct manner in critical situations. She praised his devotedness, cooperative Freudian slip, cooperative conduct, and she concluded the letter saying that overall he had completed his assigned task to the utmost satisfaction. So these people knew that there was something fishy going on, having transferred him to different departments and still seen fishy behavior, and then wrote a letter saying, hey, he's great, you should hire him. Great. So a couple months later, he transferred to another clinic. Again, patients started having unexplained emergencies, usually because of arrhythmia or a sudden decrease in blood pressure. So his superiors were obviously suspicious, but nobody said anything. They even found like 4 vials of this drug called a thing I can't pronounce, popped up on the ward where Hogel was working, and none of the patients on that ward had that drug administered or prescribed to them, which I'm assuming is what he was giving people to kill them. Finally, in 2005, he was caught in the act of administering a lethal dose of ajmaline, which was the thing they found previously, and that's what causes arrhythmia. And so this is what finally started a police investigation. So this guy had been like killing people for like 6 years when people were like, I think he's killing people, but like nobody did anything. So here we are, finally 2005, police investigation started. He was ultimately convicted of 85 murders, but it's estimated he killed more like 300 people in a 5-year period. This would make him the most prolific German serial killer if it were true. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2019, and he's currently 45 years old. 2019, is that right? Maybe it was 2009. Maybe that was a typo. Wang Chang? I'm under the impression that the QI makes a ch sound, but I could be wrong, and I apologize. So he was born January 16th, 1975 in China. He is one of China's most notorious serial killer and rapists. So he was born to an abusive family. His dad was an alcoholic and addicted to gambling. He was actually never allowed to go to school, and he committed 45 murders and 10 rapes from 1995 to 2003. He also participated in some necrophilia acts, and he was sentenced to death for these murders in 2005, which was carried out when he was 30 years old. Ahmad Saraji, born January 10th, 1949 in Indonesia. He murdered 42 women and girls from 1986 to 1997. That's a pretty short time frame. That's a lot of people. So the ages of his victims ranged from 11 to 30. They were typically strangled and buried in the ground up to their waist. So his murders were actually very ritualistic. He was a shaman, and he believed that he had supernatural powers. His clientele were typically women seeking his advice as a shaman, and they wanted guidance on like fortune or how to remain beautiful or things like that. In his past, he claims that his father had visited him in a dream and told him that he needed to murder at least 70 women as part of like a black magic ritual. And then he would need to drink their saliva in order to gain their power. So he believed by burying his victims, he would bury them from like the waist down. So they were like, their top half was like sticking out of the ground, and they were facing his house. And he thought that that would give him power. He was executed in 2008 at age 59 when they found all these like ladies just like buried in his yard, like facing his house. Isn't that weird? This one's really creepy to me. They're just like buried, sticking up out of the ground. Vasily Komarov, he was born January 1st, 1871 in Russia. So he was convicted of killing 29 people in the Moscow area from 1921 to 1923, so a 2-year period. So he's one of the earliest known serial killers of the Soviet Union / Russia. So he came from a family of alcoholics. He actually started drinking regularly when he was only 15, so that obviously had some prefrontal cortex damage. We're going to go ahead and add that into the brain damage category. So he was a horse trader, and he would typically murder his customers, which seems a little odd. Like, these are the people that are giving you your livelihood and you're just killing them? Okay. So these murders started in 1921, and they all followed a very similar formula. He would meet his customers at a stable. They would be obviously interested in a horse. He would serve them some vodka because it's Russia. And then he would kill them with a hammer or slit their throat. And then he would put them in a bag and hide them in his house, which is interesting. So within a year, his wife like obviously found out that he was killing people because there's like bodies in her house, and she was like, bet, I'm just gonna do it too. So she started helping him. Eventually cops started following him because they believed he was illegally selling alcohol, and then they like found a bunch of bodies in his house. Sorry, it's not funny, but it's just like, could you imagine being the cop that's like, this guy is selling alcohol illegally, and then you go to search his house and there's like bodies. So he was arrested in 1923 and sentenced to death when he was 52. Dean Corll, he was born December 24th, 1939 in Indiana. He is a serial killer and pedophile, so crimes against children here. He abducted, tortured, and murdered 28 teenage boys and young men from 1970 to 1973. That's a lot in 3 years. He actually had 2 accomplices. They were also teenage boys, which is kind of a fascinating dynamic, really. This case is actually fascinating from a psychological standpoint, but extremely disturbing. So David Brooks and Elmer Henley are 2 of the accomplices. I believe Elmer Henley was discussed briefly in my cancer serial killers video. Collectively, his crimes were known as the Houston mass murders, if that's something you've heard of. So he was typically luring his young victims to his house for like parties, alcohol, that sort of thing. So once they lured them to the house, they were tortured, strangled, and typically shot with a .22 caliber pistol. Coral and his 2 accomplices were burying the victims in a boat shed that he rented. There were 17 people buried in this boat shed. So summer 1973, Coral actually turned on his accomplice Elmer Henley, who was one of the ones that was helping him lure these men, and Coral ended up wanting to kill Elmer at this point. So Coral's reason for this was because Elmer had invited a girl over to their house that they were using for all these activities, and that really upset Coral. Coral decided he was just going to murder all 3 of them. Amidst a struggle, Elmer was able to escape, free his friends, and ended up shooting Coral, who died at age 33. So Elmer, who was the one that killed Dean Coral, he was actually sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year terms because he was convicted of participating in 6 of the murders. He'll be eligible for parole in 2025, so that's actually coming up. David Brooks was the other accomplice. He was sentenced to life in prison for one of the murders, and he died at age 65 in 2020 of COVID-19. Obviously, Coral didn't get a prison sentence because he died. So, hi, it's voiceover Hannah. Somehow I lost the video footage for 9 of the serial killers right in the middle of my list. So instead of going back into like a full hair and makeup situation, also my lighting isn't as good because it's nighttime. We're just going to do a voiceover for 9 of them, and then we'll go back to the video. So I apologize. Next, we have Marcel Pezio. He was born January 17th, 1897 in France. Police found the remains of his 23 victims in his basement. This all took place in Paris in World War II, but police also believe that he killed more like 60 people. He actually pretended to be a doctor during World War II, and he convinced others that he could safely transport them to South America while Germany was occupying France. What's really messed up is that he was just taking advantage of people's fear and using that in order to carry out his murders. So basically what he would do after they paid him for their safe travel, he would give them what they thought was a vaccine to travel to another country, but what it really was cyanide. So he went to trial in 1946, and he was facing 135 criminal charges. He was eventually sentenced to death and executed in 1946 at age 49, and since it's France, obviously he was executed by guillotine. Juan Vallejo Corona, he was born February 7th, 1934 in Mexico. That's not Capricorn season. Hold on. Okay, I'm not sure how he made it onto this list, but I'm making a mental note to add him in with the Aquariuses. I didn't even notice that the first time I filmed this, because I filmed all of this, I just lost the footage and I didn't even realize it. Anyway, this man's is an Aquarius, so we're skipping it. Ronald Dominique was born January 9th, 1964 in Louisiana, and he is known as the Bayou Strangler. He murdered at least 23 men and boys from 1997 to 2006, so he was active for a pretty long time. Most of his victims were black men, and he would go on walks or go for a drive and pick them up after meeting them at gay bars in the area. He would typically lure them home with alcohol, drugs, a place to sleep, or sex, and he would rape and strangle them before dumping their bodies in rural areas. His victims were typically black men, like I said, but also young boys. They ranged in age from 16 to 46. In 2006, one of his intended victims was actually let go, and he immediately went to the police with his story. Police were able to obtain a blood sample from Dominique, which connected him to the other murders. In 2008, he was sentenced to life without parole. The FBI stated that this case is the most significant serial homicide case in America over the past 2 decades based on death toll and duration. But the reason you probably haven't heard of Ronald Dominique is because all of this happened around the time of Hurricane Katrina. He is currently serving his life sentence in Louisiana, and he is 58 years old. William Bonin was born January 8, 1947 in Connecticut. He raped, tortured, and murdered at least 21 young men and boys in Southern California from 1979 to 1980, but investigators believe he is responsible for more than 36 murders in the area. He is known as the Freeway Killer because he would leave his victims' bodies along freeways in Southern California. This is a really common moniker, however. Both Patrick Kearney and Randy Graff have the same moniker, but William Bonin was the one that was active in 1980. He began raising suspicion among police officers, so they began surveilling him. After 9 days of surveillance, they finally observed him in Hollywood, attempting to lure 5 different boys into his van. He was eventually successful in luring a 17-year-old runaway named Harold, and Harold was handcuffed and bound. Police went after Bonin at this point, and they caught him mid-assault on Harold. Inside his van that he had removed all the inner handles, and he had a glove box full of newspaper clippings about his crimes. He was eventually sentenced to death, which was carried out in 1996 when he was 49. Sergey Ryakovsky was born December 29, 1962 in Russia, or at the time, the Soviet Union. He is convicted of killing 19 people in Moscow from 1988 to 1993. He would initially target homosexual men as a way to clean society. Then he would go on to murder prostitutes as well. But then later on, most of his victims ended up being elderly women. His MO was typically stabbing or strangling them. He would also mutilate their genitals and would engage in necrophilia. He was sentenced to death in 1995, but Russia put a moratorium on the death sentence in 1996, so his death sentence was commuted to life in prison. He died of tuberculosis in 2005 at age 44. Harold Shipman was born January 14, 1946, in England. He is considered the most prolific serial killer in modern history, with an estimated 250 victims. He was a general practitioner who was found guilty of murdering 15 patients in the year 2000 with lethal doses of diamorphine, which I believe is heroin. We've got a lot of doctors, and like I said earlier in the video, when doctors and medical professionals kill people, they kill a lot of people. Shipman came from a normal middle-class family. His mother died of lung cancer when she was 17, and his MO would eventually look very similar to the end of her life. She used morphine as a painkiller, and it was administered by a home doctor, and so a lot of his crimes would kind of reflect this experience. He began medical school in 1997. That's not true. It was 1970. He started working as a general practitioner in the 80s. 1998, a woman in the surgery center he worked at became suspicious of the number of deaths of his patients. And then there was also a lot of cremation requests for elderly patients that needed a counter signature. Police couldn't find sufficient evidence and closed the case a month later. Shipman's final victim was Kathleen Grundy. She died in her home in 1998 after being seen by Shipman. He signed her death certificate and marked her cause of death as old age. Grundy's will was discovered to have left $386,000 to Shipman, but Grundy also had a daughter and a granddaughter, so it didn't really make sense why she would leave her money to her doctor. Grundy's daughter, Angela, was actually a lawyer, and she immediately questioned the will's authenticity. It was then that police investigated Grundy's death, exhumed her body, and found traces of diamorphine. When Shipman was questioned about this, he claimed that Grundy was addicted to diamorphine or heroin and said that he had documented as such in her medical chart. So they went back and looked at the chart, and it turns out that all that documentation was added in after Grundy had passed away. So in 1999, at his trial, he was sentenced to life in prison for 15 murders. So once the trial was completed, police began investigating all of his patients, and that's what led to the estimate of 250 potential deaths. He was sentenced to a whole life order, but he unalived himself in 2004 when he was 57 after only serving a few years in prison. Marcelo Costa de Andrade, he was born January 2nd, 1967, in Brazil. He's convicted of killing 14 boys near Rio de Janeiro in 1991. He came from an abusive household and was sent to a boys' school. He was kicked out of the boys' school at 14. It appears that that's just the age at which you can't be in the boys' school anymore, so I don't know that he was kicked out for any particular reason. But at that age, with no support, he turned to sex work to survive. He was introduced to a cult called the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, and one of their tenets is they believe that all children go to heaven when they die. So Andrade targeted only children to carry out his murder fantasies because he was convinced that no matter what, they would go to heaven. In 1991, Andrade kidnapped 2 young boys, and he killed one of them, then took the other one on the run. The surviving child was Altair, and he was able to escape and lead authorities to Andrade. After his arrest, Andrade was determined to be mentally ill, and he was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Brazil. And as far as I can tell, he is still in the psychiatric hospital, and he is 55. Vasiliy Kulik was born January 17, 1956 in Russia, which at the time was the Soviet Union. He is convicted of killing 13 people and raping 30 from 1984 to 1986. In 1982, he graduated from a medical institute and worked as a medic at an ambulance station, which to me sounds like possibly an EMT. He used information he got from his job to break into patients' homes, where he would sexually assault the children that lived there. A lot of these times, the children would not report the crimes. In 1984, he began killing elderly women. He would drug them, sexually assault them, and strangle them. Over the next 2 years, his victims would consist of 6 children and 7 elderly women aged 2 to 75. He was arrested in January 1986 after a failed attack. He then confessed his crimes and was sentenced to death, which was carried out in 1989 when he was 33. Lydia Sharman was born December 24th, 1824 in Burlington, New Jersey. She poisoned 8 children and 3 of her husbands. 6 of the children were her own kids. She was sentenced to life in prison in 1872 and died at age 53. This is a fascinating case, but there just wasn't a lot about it on Wikipedia, so there you have it. Rebeldo Puch. Is it Puch? Puch. I don't know. He was born January 22nd in Argentina. I don't have a year. I apologize. He was convicted of 11 murders and 1 attempted murder, 17 robberies, and all of these took place in 1971. Puch and his accomplice Jorge, they would rob businesses and murder any witnesses. They even murdered a couple with a newborn baby when they were trying to steal from a Mercedes parts store. They killed the father, attempted to sexually assault the mother, and tried to shoot the newborn, but luckily they missed. So it sounds like the mother and the newborn both survived. He was arrested in 1972 and went to trial in 1980. He was sentenced to life in prison, which is a maximum sentence in Argentina. So he's currently still serving that sentence and is 70 years old. And he's currently the longest serving prisoner in Argentina, at this point having served over 50 years. Zhang Yongming was born in 1956. This is when things get weird. Okay, listen up. There are a few on this list that, despite minimal efforts to find, I could not find a date of birth. So I don't know if they ended up on the Killer Cloud list of serial killers by zodiac, if they ended up on Capricorn because that's just the first in the calendar year, or what. So there's just a few that I'm not 100% sure are Capricorns. Sorry. But they're obviously on the list for a reason, so I don't know. But some of them I just don't have birth dates for. But he was born in 1956. He did die in Capricorn season. So maybe that's why he ended up on the list. I'm not sure, but we're going to talk about him anyway. He is a serial killer and cannibal. He confessed to murdering 11 men from 2008 to 2012. And he would consume some of his victims, but he would also sell some of their meat and call it ostrich meat on the market. He was arrested in 1979 for a homicide, and he was sentenced to death, but he was released in 1997. So then police began noticing some teenagers were going missing in the area, and they were all seen near his home. So he was arrested again in 2013 when he was 56, and it is said that he showed absolutely no remorse for his crimes. I don't know anything else. That's all I got. Clifford Olsen, January 1st, 1940. He was born in Canada. He confessed to murdering 11 teenagers and children, all between the ages of 9 and 18, in a very short 1-year period in the early 80s. His MO was to sexually assault his victims and then either strangle or bludgeon them to death. And he would typically abduct them. So when he was arrested, Olsen was given the psychopathy checklist, and he scored a 38 out of 40. He was arrested in 1981 after investigators believed he had attempted to abduct 2 girls, and shortly after he was charged with murder. So he was able to get a plea deal, which has been considered pretty controversial. He confessed to 11 murders and agreed to show the police where the bodies were in exchange for $10,000 per victim to be placed in a trust fund for his wife and son. So basically he's like, I'll show you where all these children are buried that I murdered, but you need to give $100,000 to my wife, basically. And they took that deal. Like, that's screwed up. So his wife received $100,000. Olsen was sentenced to 11 concurrent life sentences, 1 for each victim. And he died of cancer in 2011 when he was 71. I I don't know. I mean, his wife didn't do anything wrong, but I don't think she should have gotten $100,000 either. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that money should have gone to the victims. I don't know. Whatever. I'm not in charge. Juana Baraza, born December 27th, 1957 in Mexico. She's known for murdering 16 elderly women in Mexico from 1998 to 2006. She was born in rural Mexico. Her mother was an alcoholic. It's alleged that she actually exchanged her daughter for 3 beers to a man who repeatedly sexually assaulted her while he had her. He eventually impregnated her with 4 children. Once she got out of that, she became a professional wrestler. Her wrestler name was the Lady of Silence, but obviously that in Spanish. Baraza's victims were typically women over 60 who lived alone. She gained their trust typically by posing as a government official or something, and she was like helping them sign up for like welfare programs was how she like got access to these women. She's typically strangled or bludgeoned her victims before robbing them, and investigators believed she was targeting women that reminded her of her mother, and she was cleansing them from society. After a long and difficult investigation, because obviously for a long time they were looking for a man, they actually saw her fleeing one of the homes of her victims in January of 2005. They were able to link her to 10 murders, but it's estimated she was actually responsible for like 40 or more. But again, they were only able to link her to 10. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison, which is a maximum sentence in Mexico. And she will most likely serve the full term, which would make her eligible for release in 2066 when she is 109, if she lives that long. She's currently 64 and serving her sentence in Mexico. Dorothea Helen Puente. She was born January 9th, 1929 in California. She is one of the ones that's a pretty fascinating case, and there's a lot to it. And if you want to know more about it, Morbid Podcast has an excellent multi-part episode series on this case, and I will put the numbers of the episodes either on the screen or in the description or both. She is a serial killer who typically targeted the elderly and the disabled. She would murder them as a way to gain their social security check. So she opened up a home or like a boarding house offering lodging to at-risk individuals, but in reality she was just taking advantage of their situation. She was ultimately arrested in 1988 after the police started poking around about a disabled man who was reported missing by his social worker. Police eventually found 7 bodies buried on her property, but they didn't initially think Dorothea was the one that was responsible, which is interesting because they're like, surely this old lady isn't like killing people, right? So when they didn't immediately arrest her, she fled to LA. She befriended a prisoner that she met at a bar. He eventually recognized her from a television program like that the police were looking for her and turned her in. She was convicted of killing 3 of her tenants, but is considered to have killed 9 from 1982 to 1988. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She maintained her innocence until she died in 2011 of natural causes when she was 82. Anatoly Utkan, born January 1st, 1943 in Russia. He's convicted of sexually assaulting and murdering 9 young girls aged 9 to 17 from 1968 to 1973. He also took trophies from each of his victims, like a watch and a sock. He did have one male victim who he stole some money from and left his body in a ditch. He was arrested in 1973 on attempted robbery charges. Not really sure how they came up with the murder charges in 1974, but he was charged with 9 murders and was sentenced to death. This death sentence was carried out in 1975 when he was 32. Joel Rifkin was born January 20th, 1959 in New York City. So he is in prison for the murders of 9 women in New York from 1989 to 1993, but police believed he killed 17 women. His parents were young college students, so they put him up for adoption. He was adopted by an upper middle class family a few weeks after he was born. He had a learning disability and did poorly in school, and he was not particularly popular with his classmates. He began killing in 1989, and his murders were very gruesome, so I will not be going into detail. In 1993, a state trooper pulled Rifkin over because he was driving without a license plate, and that's when they discovered a body in his trunk. See, this is another one. I'm like, could you imagine being a police officer? It's like, this guy's driving without a license plate. What the hell? Oh, there's a body in the trunk. Yikes. So he was sentenced to 203 years in prison after being convicted of 9 counts of murder. So he's currently serving his sentence in a maximum security prison in New York, and he is 63. And when I tell you these are gruesome, I've talked about some gruesome stuff. This is gruesome. So I'm ugh. Kioshio Kupo, born January 17th, 1935 in Japan. He raped and murdered 8 women in less than 2 months in 1971. He began raping women in the 50s, but he didn't start killing them until 1971, so that's really nice of him, I guess. So his victim ranged in age from 17 to 21. So he was arrested in May of 1971. He was ultimately sentenced to death, which they carried out in 1976 when he was 41. John Edward Robinson was born December 27th, 1943 in Illinois. He is a serial killer, conman, embezzler, kidnapper, and forger. He committed 3 murders in the Kansas City, Missouri area from 1984 to 2000, which is a really long time frame, but he was doing a lot of other stuff, it sounds like. So he was born to an alcoholic father and a very strict mother. He moved to Kansas City in 1964, where he married his wife Nancy. They had 4 children. It is believed that he's committed more murders that we haven't discovered yet. His crimes took place in the mid-90s, but he's considered the internet's first serial killer, which is interesting. A lot of his victims were sourced from online chat rooms about like BDSM and dominating relationships and stuff. So in the 80s when he was killing, before the internet came around, he was opening these like shell companies, these like fake companies, and then he would hire people to work for him. And he would particularly hire women that were like struggling. So his first victim was Paula Godfrey. She was hired to work at his company in 1984, and then her family never saw her again. They obviously put in a missing persons report, and then a few days later they received a typed letter supposedly coming from their daughter. And it's basically said that she was okay, but she didn't want to come home. The police then closed the case because they had this letter from her saying that she was fine. And then in 1985, a year later, he hired Lisa Stassi. He promised her a job, an apartment, and daycare for her 4-month-old daughter. And then when he hired her, Robinson made her sign a blank piece of stationery. Never do that, ever. I don't care if it's your mom. I don't care if it's your mom asking you to do it. Don't sign a blank piece of paper. A few days later, Robinson contacted Stassi's next of kin saying that she had unalived herself. He requested $5,500 in legal fees in order to handle her death, and then promised to adopt out her daughter. After going to jail for fraud in Kansas from 1987 to 1991, and then again in Missouri until 1993, he met prison librarian Beverly Bonner, who left her husband to work for him. Robinson. Bonner left her husband to work for Robinson. Got it? Okay. After Robinson was able to set up Beverly's alimony checks in his name, she was never seen again. And it turns out Robinson was actually able to cash Beverly's alimony checks for like years, which I believe come monthly, right? That's crazy. So at this point, this is when he discovered the online chat rooms, and he began entering chat rooms about BDSM, and he was looking for submissive female partners. He got in contact with Sheila Faith, and he portrayed himself as a wealthy businessman, and he offered to pay Sheila's disabled daughter's medical expenses and give her a job. Sheila and her daughter moved all the way from California to Kansas City to work for Robinson on these promises, but they were never seen again. Robinson was actually able to cash Sheila's pension checks for 7 years after she went missing. Apparently I didn't finish this one. I just have like an empty bullet point. Let me just put like what happened right here. I guess I just like, this was like I took a break and then I never finished it. So sorry. Christopher Peterson, born January 20th, 1969 in Indiana. He's connected to 7 deaths within a 2-month period in 1990 in Indiana. His victims were all killed with a shotgun, and witnesses all described a clean-shaven, slender, white man with long, stringy brown hair. Peterson, however, is clearly a black man and doesn't fit the description. Peterson was arrested for an unrelated crime. Evidence was poorly handled, and he ended up being at the top of the suspect list for these 7 deaths. The trial was very complicated. There was lots of suspects, lots of victims, lots of jurisdictions. Eventually, Peterson was charged with 4 counts of murder and robbery and was sentenced to death, which was commuted to 120 years in prison. He'll be eligible for release in 2050 when he is 81 years old. He's currently 53 and maintains his innocent. This one's a little sketchy. I don't know. I'm not going to go into all the details of the complexities because it's a lot, but I don't know. I don't know about this. Obviously this person has committed crimes, but like Anatoly Silvco, he was born December 28th, 1938 in Russia, Soviet Union. He's convicted of killing 7 teenage boys from 1964 to 1985 in Russia. This one's weird. I always find it fascinating when people have some sort of like witnessed a trauma or experienced a trauma and then carry that out repeatedly. Very fascinating to me. So in this case, he believes his obsession with killing boys in this age group comes from this fatal accident that he witnessed when he was 23. He saw a young teen boy in a Young Pioneers uniform, which is like Soviet Union, like youth group thing. He was hit by a drunk motorcyclist and died, and he witnessed this event happen. And for some reason, he was sexually aroused by this, and he would go on to want to recreate this feeling again. So a couple years later, he went on to start a youth program in order to get victims, which is screwed up. He would select 1 or 2 victims a year, and he would spend a lot of time grooming them. They were all typically aged 11 to 15. They were all typically really small for their age. He would have them wear young pioneers' uniforms to recreate this event. He would gain their confidence over a long period of time. He would convince them to participate in this little experiment that he had. And he said that it would make them taller by stretching their spine. Okay? Because he was targeting these boys that were small, right? So he was like, oh, I can make you taller. I just have to stretch your spine. And so it involved hanging them, like by the neck. And he said he would convince them that they would hang for a little bit, it would stretch their spine, and then Silvco would revive them. While the boys were unconscious, he would molest them and masturbate repeatedly. A total of 43 boys participated in this experiment, and he filmed 36 of them. However, most of the boys he did revive. He just took advantage of them while they were unconscious, but 7 of them, he got so excited to the point where he would dismember the bodies and kill them. And after murdering them, he would set fire to the victims, and it just all kind of reminded him of that traffic accident that he witnessed. So in 1985, a prosecutor became suspicious of all these missing boys in the area. Again, he was running this youth home. It was for like underprivileged or like homeless boys, you know, so it was like kind of hard to keep track of them, I guess. But eventually all these missing boys led him to this youth program. He would question some of the kids, and all of them reported these experiments and that they had temporary amnesia, but obviously they didn't know what happened while they were unconscious. So eventually he was arrested in 1985. He had film evidence of all of these experiments. So he was accused of 7 murders, 7 counts of sexual abuse, and 7 counts of necrophilia. He was sentenced to death, which was carried out in 1989 when he was 50 years old. Ivan Milat, this is one of the best-known Australian serial killers. He was born December 27th, 1944 in Australia. I believe there's a Morbid podcast episode about this. I'll put it up or put it below. So he's known as the backpacker murderer, which is a lot of backpacker murderer. So he was accused of killing 7 people from 1989 to 1992. His MO obviously was to approach backpackers. They were all along Hume Highway, and he was like, hey, I can drive you wherever you're going. Almost always take them to Belanglo State Forest. I don't know if I'm saying that right. He would incapacitate them, torture them, and murder them. And he is known as Australia's worst serial killer. 1992, his victims began being discovered by like runners, hikers, people in the area. And people obviously were like, oh my God, these people are dying. Who's killing these people? Well, who's to help solve the murder but Paul Onions? That's right. Paul Onions was responsible for Milat's capture. So it's 1993. Police are like launching this huge investigation into these murders. And Onions called and was like, hey, something kind of weird happened to me back in 1990. Let me tell you about it. So he was backpacking across Australia. He encountered a man along his journey that offered him a ride. About a kilometer from Belanglo State Forest, the driver pulled over, pulled out a revolver and ropes, and told Onions he was being robbed. Onions was like, hell no, and ran away. He was able to flag down this motorist, and her name was Joanne Barry. We got Onions and Barry here, people. Barry took him to safety, and both Onions and Barry were able to describe the events similarly. Based on the description and the vehicle, they were led to Ivan Milat. Milat was arrested in 1994, at which time many weapons were discovered at his homes and a lot of items belonging to his victims as well. He was charged and found guilty with 7 murders. He was sentenced to a life sentence for each murder without the possibility of parole. Milat maintains his innocence despite having an overwhelming amount of evidence to the contrary. He died in 2019 of stomach and esophagus cancer at age 74. Rhonda Bell Martin, she was born in 1907. No date of birth. Might not be a Capricorn. So sorry. In 1956, she confessed to poisoning her mother, 2 husbands, and 3 of her children. According to an article published in Life magazine at the time, she loved the attention and sympathy that she got after the deaths of her family members, which was why she kept killing them. Her 5th husband, who was actually her former stepson, survived her poisoning attempt but was left paraplegic. So his survival and his ongoing health issues was what made investigators suspicious of Rhonda. She was convicted of only 1 murder, but she was suspected to have killed 6 people from 1937 to 1951. She was eventually sentenced to death, which was carried out in 1957 when she was 50 years old. Alexander Rubel, born December 25th, 1980 in Ukraine. He is convicted of killing 6 people in Estonia. He started killing people when he was 17. His crimes took place from 1997 to 1998, so he was tried as a minor and was released from prison after 8 years. So he is currently 41 and was last known to be living back in the Ukraine, but some people think he's still in Estonia, and he's just oot and a boot. Joseph Nasso was born January 7th, 1934 in New York. He's convicted of raping and murdering 5 women from 1977 to 1994. It's believed he's murdered up to 10 women, but we know of 5. He was in the Air Force in the 50s, and he had 2 wives and 1 son. They settled down in Reno, Nevada, where he started working as a freelance photographer. His friends and neighbors all called him Crazy Joe because he really liked to shoplift, and he was like 70 years old. So they were just like, this is Crazy Joe. He was arrested in 2010 for violating parole. He had been arrested for some of his petty crimes at one point. Police searched his home and found a handwritten diary in which he listed 10 women with geographical locations. Further research into these women's names determined they were related to unsolved murders that took place in California. He was arrested and convicted of 4 murders in 2013. He was sentenced to death, so he's currently on death row, and he is 88. So something interesting about his victims, a lot of their names had like the same first letter. So Tracy Tafoya, Carmen Colon, and Pamela Parsons, for example. So there is this unsolved murder case from New York called the Alphabet Murders that took place from 1971 to 1973, and they all had a similar pattern. The victims had like the names, the first names of the first and the first letters of the first and last name were the same. And so a lot of people for a long time thought that this was Joseph Nasso because he lived in the area at the time, but it turns out that he has been ruled out by DNA evidence. So just a weird coincidence. Terry Rasmussen, born December 23rd, 1943 in Colorado. He killed at least 6 people across multiple decades across the US. And his MO was to not have an MO. He used a lot of different aliases. He killed all over the place, and because of this they called him the chameleon killer, and that's what made him so hard to capture and why he was able to kill for decades. So he was born in Colorado, raised in Arizona, dropped out of high school, enlisted in the Navy, had a wife and 4 kids. Seems pretty normal. However, in 1975 his wife left him and took the children, and so then he started moving around. He lived in 9 different states, and he would typically work as an electrician, which gave him access to people's homes. But turns out he would actually typically only murder his girlfriends, which is really interesting because most murderers who get away with it for so long murder people that aren't associated with them. But in reality, he was murdering his girlfriends and their children. He wasn't even connected to the murders until 2017 through genetic DNA provided by one of his children. However, Rasmussen had died in 2010 from cancer, so he would never actually face charges for his crimes. So criminologist Jack Levin stated that Rasmussen is unlike any serial killer he has ever studied. What distinguishes Rasmussen from most serial killers is that he targeted people with whom he had a relationship. Most serial killers would never do that. It's the last thing they would do. Instead, they focus on complete strangers. So he was connected to these murders but never tried because he was dead. Ian Brady, he was born January 2nd, 1938 in England. I believe I talked about his partner in crime, Myra Hindley, in the, I don't remember what video she was in, I'll put it here. These crimes are very upsetting and gruesome, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but him and his girlfriend Myra Hindley are suspected in the murders of 5 children aged 10 to 17 in the Manchester area from 1963 to 1965. Their crimes are heinous, indescribable, consisting of sexual assault and torture of children. Their victims were buried in an area called the Saddleworth Moors. It's like this huge marsh area in northwest England. So that's why they're called collectively as the Moors Murders. So in 1965, Brady and Hindley were attempting to abduct their next victim, which was 17-year-old Edward Evans, and they were trying to convince him to come back to their house for like alcohol. Brady had decided in this crime to include Myra's brother-in-law, Smith, but after witnessing the whole ordeal, Smith was very disturbed and went home to his wife, which was Myra's sister, Maureen, and he called the police and they were able to set up a sting. Brady was diagnosed as a psychopath in 1985 and committed to Ashworth Hospital, where he died in 2017 of pulmonary disease when he was 79. Cynthia Kaufman was born January 19, 1962 in Missouri. She's convicted of murdering 2 women in California, along with her boyfriend, James Marlowe. She met Marlowe in Arizona, and they began using meth together and committing violent crimes. They were arrested in 1986 for murdering 4 women, and Kaufman immediately confessed to the crimes, which makes me think that her boyfriend Marlowe was like really the one doing it, but she confessed because she was like all wrapped up in the thing. She is currently on death row in California, and she is 60 years old. Ray Copeland was born December 30th, 1914 in Oklahoma. Him and his wife, Faye Copeland, Ray and Faye, would you just look at them? They are the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. Ray was 76 and Faye was 69 when they received their life sentences. They were convicted of killing 5 of their farmhands at their home in Missouri, but it's estimated that they have more like 12 victims total. Ray was raised during the Great Depression and often struggled to survive, so he picked up habits of petty crime. Because of his prior crimes, he was like known as a fraud, so he would often hire drifters or like transient people to work on his farm, and then he would send them out to buy cattle, but he would send them with a bad check. Because if he went up there with a bad check, they'd be like, that's probably a bad check. So he would send these farmhands out there with a bad check to go buy the cattle. But after they got the money, or after they got the cattle from the bad checks, he would kill the farmhands and then sell the cattle that he stole. It turns out though in 1989, one of his intended victims was able to escape and he went to the police. Ray and Faye were both sentenced to death in 1991. And after hearing about the fate of his wife, Ray was like, well, those things happen, you know. Ray eventually died of natural causes in 1993, and he only served 2 years in jail. Claude Lassenet, that's definitely not how that is pronounced, but that's the best I can do. He was born January 19th, 1971 in France. He's convicted of murdering 5 elderly women in a 5-month period from 1993 to 1994. He was arrested in 1994 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 18 years. He is currently 51. That was the shortest Wikipedia article I have ever read, and that's all there was on there. Philip Karl Jablonski, that's a name. He was born January 3rd, 1946 in California. He's convicted of killing 5 women in California and Utah from 1978 to 1991. So his dad was an abusive alcoholic. His dad beat and sexually abused his wife and all of his children. Jablonski also had a history of abusing his first 2 wives, so he took after his father. They would eventually leave him, and he would go on to rape and murder other women. So his first victim was Laura Kimball. She met and married him in 1977, and they had a child together shortly after. In 1978, Kimball tried to leave Jablonski after he had attempted to rape her mother. Upon returning to their shared apartment to collect her things, Jablonski murdered Kimball. He served 12 years for Kimball's murder and was released on parole for good behavior. And in 1990, when he was released, he would go on to kill 4 more women. Jablonski was sentenced to death in 1994 and died of unknown causes in December of 2019 at age 73. Janie Lou Gibbs. She was born December 25th, 1932 in Georgia. She killed her 3 sons, a grandson, and her husband by poisoning them with arsenic from 1966 to 1967. She ran a daycare out of her home, and she was a very dedicated member of her local church. She and her husband Marvin had been married for 18 years before she started killing her family members. Her husband Marvin was the first to be poisoned in 1965, and she poisoned his dinner initially, which only ended up sending him to the hospital. But while he was in the hospital, she brought him some soup, which was poisoned, and that killed him. The doctors determined the cause of death to be liver disease, and Gibbs donated all the money from her husband's life insurance to the church. 8 months later, she poisoned her youngest son Marvin, who was 13. So we have... her youngest son is also Marvin. So we have Marvin Jr. was 13. Doctor ruled his cause of death as liver disease, because 13-year-olds just get liver disease. And they just were like, oh, he probably inherited it from his father. So then again, she donated a large portion of his life insurance to the church. 5 months later, her 16-year-old son Melvin. So we have Marvin, and Melvin. This had to have been confusing. She was probably just killing them because she was tired of mixing up their names all the time. 16-year-old son Melvin died suddenly, and doctors diagnosed him with a rare muscular disorder. His life insurance was also donated to the church. And then they had Robert, Melvin, Marvin, and Robert. Robert was 19 and he had a child named Raymond. Gibbs poisoned Raymond and then Robert a few months later. The concurrent deaths of the infant and the son were what finally raised suspicion because they were otherwise considered to be healthy, obviously. Gibbs was actually eventually arrested on her birthday/Christmas in 1967, and autopsies would determine that all 5 of her victims had been poisoned with arsenic. Gibbs was initially found mentally unfit to stand trial, so she was sent to a mental institution, and they employed her as a cook. Excuse me? Later, she would go on to stand trial after she had spent some time at the mental institution, and she was sentenced to 5 life sentences. She was eventually diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and released from prison into the care of her sister in 1999. She died in 2010 in a nursing home when she was 77. Vincent Johnson, he was born January 6, 1969 in New York. He is known as the Brooklyn Strangler and is convicted of murdering 5 people from 1999 to 2000. He typically targeted prostitutes, and police initially arrested a homeless man who was cleared of their crimes after DNA evidence. The homeless man they initially arrested, however, was able to start helping the task force and led them to Vincent Johnson, another homeless man in the area who was known to use crack cocaine and had a fixation with sadomasochistic sex. Johnson refused to give DNA evidence, but an investigator saw him spitting on the street, and they were able to collect that saliva sample and used it to determine he had left DNA on 4 victims that were in their system. He confessed to murdering 5 women and is a suspect in a 6th murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and he's currently serving his sentence in New York, and he is 53. Hirokai Hadaka, he was born April 6th, 1962 in Japan. He robbed and murdered 4 women in a 5-month period in 1966. He was arrested in September of that year and sentenced to death in the year 2000. He was hanged in 2006 when he was 44. Wayne Bowden was born in 1948 in Canada. He might not be a Capricorn. I don't have a birth date. He is a rapist and serial killer charged with killing 4 women, and he was given the nickname the Vampire Rapist because he would often bite the breasts of his victims. He was given 4 life sentences and is the first murder conviction in North America based on forensic odontological evidence. Teeth marks. But I feel like Ted Bundy was also part of his trial too, so I don't know. Okay, we have Thor Nis Christensen, born December 28th, 1957 in Denmark. Him and his parents would eventually immigrate to the United States when he was 5. He committed his crimes in California from 1976 to 1979. He would become obsessed with fantasies of shooting women and assaulting their corpses. He murdered 4 women and sexually assaulted their bodies post-mortem. His 5th intended victim was Lydia Preston, and she survived despite being shot in the head. Preston would eventually run into Christensen 3 months after her attack and would turn him into police. He was found guilty in 1980 and was sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 1981 after being stabbed in the exercise yard, and he was 23. James Velasquez, he was born December 24th, 1979 in Australia. He is one of 3 men responsible for the Snowtown Murders of 1992 to 1999. If you haven't heard of them, you should look them up. So if you're unfamiliar, the Snowtown Murders was a period of time in which 12 people were murdered and left in barrels in an abandoned bank vault in Snowtown, Australia. Velasquez had 2 accomplices, and one of the victims was actually Velasquez's own half-brother. John Bunting, however, was the person that was considered to be in charge of the whole thing. Bunting believed that most of their victims were homosexuals, pedophiles, or just weak in general, and that they needed to be removed from society or whatever. Velasquez was ultimately sentenced to 4 life sentences with no parole for 26 years, and he's currently 42. Buddy Earl Justice, he was born December 25th, 1952 in New York. He's convicted of killing 3 women across 3 states in 1 month in 1978. He was convicted of all 3 murders and received the death sentence, and he was executed in 1990 at age 37. Patrick McCullough was born January 20th, 1960 in Alaska, and he murdered 3 people from 1980 to 2001. He died in November of 2001 after a murder-suicide between him and his girlfriend when his girlfriend tried to break up with him. Jose Rodriguez, he was born December 3rd, 1957 in Spain. He raped and killed at least 16 elderly women, all aged 91 to 63. Why did I say that way? 61 to 93 in Spain from August 1987 to April 1988. That's just an 8-month period. That's 2 people a month. Jeez. Rodriguez had a vengeance against his mother because she kicked him out of the house because he beat up his terminally ill father. I would kick him out too. But he was like mad, so he started killing old ladies. Whatever. So, like I said, the murders all happened in 1987 to 1988. In 1978, he was arrested and sentenced to 27 years in prison for raping women. However, he's like super charismatic, and he was able to convince his victims to drop to the charges, so he only served 8 years in prison. In 1986, he was released, and his wife left him. So he eventually married a mentally disabled woman who he would go on to like torture and humiliate. However, he was able to convince those around him that he was a good man, a good husband, a hardworking man. He was arrested in 1988 and eventually confessed to his crimes. He was diagnosed as a psychopath and sentenced to 440 years in prison. In 2002, he was murdered by an inmate and he was 44. All right, here we are. This is the one that I was talking about at the beginning. This is the case of a serial killer that really just, I find very disturbing, scary. Like, this guy freaks me out more than any other serial killer. And you might be like, why? But I don't know, just when you really think about the mind that this person has to do these things, I mean, all of them are bad, but this one just really kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies more than anyone. Okay, this is the story of Israel Keyes. He was born January 7th, 1978 in Utah. He is a serial killer, bank robber, arsonist, kidnapper, rapist, and necrophile, and he's convicted of killing 3 people, but it's believed he's killed more than a dozen. And I'll get to why it's so hard to track down the people that he's killed. So he was raised with 9 siblings in a Mormon household. His family moved to a very remote area in Washington when he was 5. Him and his siblings were all very isolated from society. They were homeschooled, very indoctrinated into this church called the Ark, which was a white supremacist church in the area. So when he started, getting older, late teens, early adulthood, he started telling his family that he didn't really believe in God and that he was having atheist thoughts. So his family kicked him out and disowned him. After this, he kind of took a 180 and started becoming obsessed with Satanism and ritualistic murder. Keyes would go on to travel all over the United States, and he would target random people and murder them, leaving almost no trace. He spent months meticulously planning each crime, and he would stash murder kits, which were gallon-sized waterproof buckets he would bury in the ground near the areas where he wanted to kill someone. Months before the crime would take place, he would bury these murder kits and then come back and use the murder kits to obtain the items he needed to kill somebody and then just kill a random person. So basically what he would do is he would just like travel somewhere to one of his murder kits, kill somebody, leave. And so it's like, there wasn't even any proof that he was there. It would all happen so fast. You know what I mean? That part right there, the murder kits and the random targeting, is what really freaks me out. And that's what really freaks me out about Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. It was kind of the same. Like, he would just kill random people, which, like, ultimately, like, that's how all serial killers are. But there's some, like, this traveling, I don't know, it just really, creeps me out. And this is another scary part. So there is actually video surveillance footage of him abducting one of his victims. It was 18-year-old Samantha Conan. She was abducted from the coffee booth she was working at in Anchorage, Alaska. It's kind of like a scooters. Do you have like scooters near you? It's just like this tiny little building that's a drive-through for coffee. That's it. And she was working there by herself, which, like, this is just something for anyone, male or female. If you are working in an establishment and they want you to work a shift alone, I would not work there. Like, if there's not at least 2 people working together, no matter where you're working, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, especially when there's customers coming up and you're engaging with the public, like, I don't know. I would just think twice about that. It's not safe. So after he abducted Samantha, he sexually assaulted her and killed her the next day. He would go on to send a ransom letter to her family for $30,000. And he even sent them a photo of her, like, tied up with, like, the newspaper saying, like, here's your daughter, pay me $30,000 and you can have her back. It turns out, this is fucked up, she was actually dead in the photo that he sent to her family, and he disposed of her body in a lake after he took the picture. After he did this whole ransom thing, he fled to Texas, and he would go on to use Samantha's ATM card for a while. So Texas Highway Patrol was eventually able to, like, track him down, and they found Samantha's cell phone in his car. So in 2012, he actually unalived himself when he was 34. He was awaiting trial, so he never got to go to trial. He left a suicide note with a drawing of 11 skulls with, like, a pentagram, and so detectives are believing that he killed 11 people. So we don't know of everybody that he killed at this point, but that's just a guess based on this drawing that he left. And like I said, this is one of the ones that, like, really freaks me out more than any other. Okay, we just have a few more. Özgür Cengiz. He was born 1984 in Turkey. Not sure of the date. He might not be a Capricorn. He is suspected to have killed 3 men, and he was suspected to have eaten one of them from 1997 to 2007. So he was seen arguing with one of his final victims, and the police were able to track him down. He was said to have no remorse for his crimes, and confessed that he was irresistibly drawn to eating human flesh. He would often go into fits of laughter when talking about his crimes, which is really unsettling. He was found guilty of 2 murders and then sentenced to 2 life sentences because of those murders. And the courts eventually found him mentally unfit to stand trial. So his life sentence was overthrown and he was sent to a mental hospital. He's currently chilling in the mental hospital and he is 37. George Joseph Smith was born January 11th, 1872 in England. He was executed in 1953 for killing 3 women, and he became known as the Brides in the Bath Murders. His MO was to marry a woman. He would convince them to steal from their employers, and then he would steal their savings and leave them without a trace. He would do this to 7 women from 1986 to 1914. So in 1915, the city coroner went to investigators because there were 2 murders that took place really close together that he thought were really suspicious. Both women were found dead in their bathtubs, and they both had really big life insurance policies that were collected by their husbands. George Smith had married another wife, Bessie, in 1910. They rented a house with no bathtub, and 7 weeks later, he rented a bathtub. Bessie was found dead in that bathtub shortly after from drowning. Smith, however, claimed his wife died from a fit of epilepsy, and Bessie's will had been drawn up only 5 days before, which left Smith with the equivalent of $272,000 in today's money. So this obviously made the investigator even more suspicious, and he would go on to investigate these crimes by trying to figure out how they died in a bathtub by themselves. So he would measure the women's heights and he would measure the size of the bathtub, and he determined that if they did have a seizure while in the tub, most of the time their body would stiffen. So like when you're sitting in a tub, your feet are like at the edge of at the end of the tub, and the top part of your body is out of the water, right? And then when you stiffen up, it should push you out of the water, right? However, these women were found opposite. They were found with their heads in the water and their feet out of the tub, which he just thought was really weird. So this investigator went so far as to get a tub and hire these women who were the same size as the victims. And so he was trying to do experiments to find out like what would cause these women to drown. So what he realized was most likely these women, their feet were quickly pulled up out of the tub, causing their heads to go underwater really fast, and then they would not have time to like hold their breath, or they might even breathe in like out of shock and then breathe in a bunch of water. So after he figured this out, he decided that George Smith was probably the one that was killing his wife. So he was arrested in 1915 for the murders of Bessie Williams, Alice Smith, and Margaret Lloyd. So he was only charged for the murder of Bessie Mundy, and the prosecutors basically used the similarities between their deaths to establish a pattern, which they used in his sentencing. So he was sentenced to death and was hanged 2 months after trial when he was 43. Francesca Ballastros, she was born in 1969 in Spain. I don't have a birth date, so I'm not 100% sure she's a Capricorn, but she was on the Capricorn list. So in 1990, she poisoned her 5-month-old daughter. Originally, she wanted to kill her whole family and like leave town, because I guess she was just like over it. But then she was like, wait, if I kill my whole family right now, people are going to be suspicious. So she poisoned her daughter and then waited 14 years to kill the rest of her family. When 14 years rolled around, she had met another man online and she wanted to go and live with him. So she decided to get rid of her family and run away. In 2004, Ballastros killed her husband with sedatives and then killed her daughter with medications that are used to treat alcoholism. It's the same thing she used on her first daughter that she killed. She tried to kill her 12-year-old son as well, but he survived. Ballastros was arrested a few months later and confessed. She was sentenced to 84 years in prison. She is currently serving her sentence in Spain and is 51. Eltomio Sanchez was born January 19th, 1958 in Puerto Rico. His family moved to Buffalo, New York when he was 2 years old though, so all of his crimes took place in New York. He raped and murdered at least 3 women and raped up to 15 other girls in New York from 1975 to 2006, which is a 31-year time frame. Sanchez was actually very involved in his community. He was very well liked. A lot of his neighbors called him Uncle Al because he was very friendly with his neighbors and had a good rapport. His MO was to attack women along a bike path. He would rape and strangle them to death with a cord or a garrote. He was eventually linked to his crimes using DNA evidence and was arrested in 2007. He was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, so he's currently serving that sentence and he is 64 years old. Stephen Griffiths was born December 24th, 1969 in England. He was charged with killing 3 women from 2009 to 2010. He typically targeted sex workers in his area, and he would dump them in a local river. He called himself the crossbow cannibal and was diagnosed as a schizoid psychopath. He had fantasies about becoming a serial killer in 1991 when he did time for attacking a supermarket manager with a knife. Griffiths claimed to have 2 other victims, which are currently being investigated, and he was sentenced to a whole life order in 2010. And he is currently serving his sentence in England, and he is 52. Billy Glaze is actually a Cancer. He was incorrectly added to the Capricorn list because he died in Capricorn season, but he was born in Cancer season. But I already covered the Cancers, so we're talking about him now. He's a suspect in at least 50 murders in the United States, and he told investigators he's killed over 20 women. So when 2 Native American women were murdered in Minneapolis, Glaze's girlfriend led them to look for him in New Mexico. He was arrested in 1987 driving under the influence in New Mexico. They found a bloody shirt, a crowbar, and a nightstick in his truck. Hair samples on the nightstick were used to convict him of murder, and he was sentenced to prison without parole for 52 years. The Innocence Project actually did some DNA testing in 2009 in regards to this case. So semen from the first victim's rape kit didn't match Glaze, and a cigarette butt next to the second victim had the same DNA as the rape kit. So both of them belonged to a convicted rapist in Minnesota. Turns out eyewitnesses who had testified that Glaze had murdered the 2 victims in Minneapolis had also been eyewitnesses in 60 other murders. So this guy is just going around like accusing people of murder 60 times. Glaze's attorney actually did call for a retrial for DNA evidence, but he died in 2015 of lung cancer while waiting for the retrial after spending 25 years in jail. Joe Ball was born January 7th, 1896 in Texas. He's convicted of killing 2 women in the 1930s, but he's believed to have killed over 20 women total. Wikipedia claims that this story is considered folklore, so let's take this with a grain of salt. He's known as the Alligator Man or the Butcher of Elmendorf. A lot of women in the area went missing, and they were all connected to Bell. Police went to question him, and then he immediately shot himself in the heart in 1938 when he was 42. Norman Afzal Simons, he was born January 12, 1967 in South Africa. He's a rapist and serial killer who was ultimately charged with the rape and murder of a 10-year-old boy named Elroy in 1995. He's known to have a total of 22 victims and is currently serving a life sentence in South Africa, and he's 55. All right, that is all of the known Capricorn serial killers, but I apologize, there's probably a few of them that are not Capricorns. I did my best. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you found it fascinating, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I have lots of other different types of content on my channel, and I hope you stay tuned for the rest of this series. We are making our way through all of the zodiac signs and all of the serial killers. So I hope you stay tuned, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye. My stomach is making the most insane noises. Do you hear that? I hope you can't hear that. That's really embarrassing. Ahmad's... Am I gonna shit my pants? I feel like I'm gonna shit my pants. What is going on? What did I eat? What did I eat yesterday? I had a steak Philly. Okay, whatever.